And welcome everyone for coming today, and thank you very much for giving up your time. My name's David Allen. I'm a farmer and CFA volunteer from Western Victoria near Warrandoo. We've got a farm near Warrandoo, long-term family farm. We're on Djapurong country, and we just like to acknowledge the Indigenous leaders from the past and the current ones, and the emerging leaders. So the focus of this forum is to highlight the importance of roadside burning, and because it's we're looking at reasons as to why the roadside burning is in decline, and explore some of the ways that agencies and the general community can support the CFA to get the roads burned again. So because of the large numbers of people on board, I think the direction is to make sure your computers are muted, and just use the chat function to ask any questions. We will do our best to answer all the questions, and throughout the session, either just after the speakers have had their talk or later on in a Q&A session. So rest assured we'll try and get all the questions answered. So we shall see how we go. Another aspect, or something that I did a number of years ago, 2018, in fact, I was lucky enough to be chosen with a number of other CFA volunteers, and we went up to the Gulf of Carpentaria. We were not far from the Northern Territory border at Hell's Gate, and we were in Gangalida and Garrawal country, where we did an Indigenous burning program up there for a week. So we were embedded there for a week and learned lots and lots about the culture and about cultural burning. So I just mentioned that because what we're talking about today is not cultural burning. There is cultural burning done in Victoria, and some brigades are involved in that, and it's to their credit, but it's fairly specific and it's a fairly small area. But we're talking about burning the roadside, so it's a slightly different process, although the principles are sort of the same. So without further ado, we better kick along. Our first speaker is Dr. John Morgan, Associate Professor at Department of Ecology, Environment and Evolution at La Trobe Uni. John's been intrigued by native grasslands of the Western District for many, many years. The wheat plants and animals of grasslands never cease to amaze him, and he's tried hard to figure out how we can protect them. At his heart is a strong desire to conserve this precious system by bringing the community along for the ride. So, Dr. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dave. I'm just going to share a presentation. I'm assuming that's sharing, Dave, is it? It's just a white screen at the moment?
Yep, I think so.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And thanks everyone for coming today. It's a great pleasure to be here with you to talk about grasslands on roadsides. I'm the warm-up act, I'm the entree before we get into some nitty-gritty, but I'm here to hopefully impress upon you just how important grasslands are in Western Victoria. And I want to start by taking us back in time to when the plains of Western Victoria were first starting to form. It's about 3 million years ago, and that's relatively recently in Australia's history of the continent. And something was afoot, something not unlike what's currently happening today in Spain. A bunch of volcanoes started to erupt about 3 million years ago, closest to Melbourne initially. And they started oozing out their lava across the landscape. And it started filling in the low parts and creating this very extensive plain. And they kept on erupting all the time up until about only 10,000 years ago, coming from Melbourne and working their way down through Western Victoria to beyond Hamilton. And what resulted as a consequence of that is an amazing outcome. One of the world's largest lava plains sits in Western Victoria, the third largest lava plain in the world. Here's an image of just that lava plain, and what it shows is various parts of the Western districts, and you might be able to figure out where you're from. And we just have a whole bunch of ages of those lava flows. So if we look at number 5 near Melbourne, the Keilor Plains, that's aged at about 2.5 to 2.8 million years ago when it first erupted. And so this is really, really important for thinking about grasslands in Western Victoria. This is a really young geology, and hence it's a really young ecosystem that subsequently developed. What's really interesting about these grasslands, these plains, is that it were grasslands that basically colonised the area. Trees don't like this country very much. The soils are such that it's a bit too waterlogged for most eucalypts, and it's really fertile in a relative sense. So grasses and herbs do really well. So these grasslands started forming, and they were colonised by megafauna. So we had diprotodons, these big wombat-like animals the size of a car. We had some of the world's biggest birds ever to be on the planet wandering through Western Victoria sometime in the last little bit. And we had these marsupial lions, things called thylacolea, which were basically hunting animals on these Western plains. And so this is a really important part of Australia's natural heritage in some respects, or many respects. Then about 45,000 years ago, Aboriginals who'd moved through Northern Australia come through what's called Sahel when the sea levels were lower. They made their way down through Eastern and Western Australia. And you can see the ages here of cave art that gives us a bit of a date of when people turned up. And so they moved into Western Victoria potentially 45,000 years ago. What were they doing? Well, they were doing a couple of things. They were manipulating landscapes. So here's a really old hand drawing of women collecting yams, yam daisies, because grasslands are fabulous places for those tuberous types of plants. And they were manipulating fire regimes to advantage things such as hunting for game or creating conditions that would actually attract game. So this landscape has had human use and modification for a really long period of time. So it's not like it's only happened in the last 200 years. But 200 years ago, something pretty profound happened. Major Mitchell worked his way down from Sydney and came into the Western Districts on one of his major expeditions, his third expedition. And he worked his way through Hamilton and Beaufort, as you can see here, you might be able to see on the map, and he waxed lyrical about this country. In fact, one of his most famous quotes is this: "And in returning over the flowery plains and green hills, fanned by the breezes of early spring, I name this region Australia Felix." And here's an image from Von Gerard of quite probably somewhere where Mitchell wandered past. These large expansive plains that largely didn't contain very many trees. And in fact, there's some really great archival evidence for what these plains look like. This is the Chalicum collection, a series of paintings taken up near Ararat, looking across the plains in the 1850s. So actually predating that image I just showed you. And so the plains are extensive. They've got scattered timber. In fact, if you didn't know anything better, you might think you're on the Serengeti. We just don't have the wildebeest, do we? Here's another of those images now looking the opposite way, back towards Mount Cole and the mountain range that way, showing that humans were already, or that European humans were already in this landscape. They were already bringing sheep. They were already got shepherds in this landscape. But what we look at is the grasslands, this extensive grassy plain. And in many respects, Europeans and others who flocked to this country after the colonisation of Australia by the British were actually rushing. This was a grass rush. It predated the gold rush. And so this landscape was occupied really, really early on. What they came to was a landscape full of kangaroo grass from one end of the plains to the other. Really highly nutritious, really interesting species that dominated almost to the exclusion of most other grasses in this landscape. And they saw wildflowers, these fantastic displays of herbaceous plants that would have been really common from one end of the plains to the other. Those wildflowers came in a variety of colours and types. Here's just a field of orchids looking absolutely fabulous. In many respects, we tend to underplay just how important those early observations would have been, because for many of these wildflowers, they're not short-lived. They're almost like trees that live below ground. So here's an example of one of those, pussy tails or a type thereof. And here's the root system on the right-hand side. that just demonstrates, and that's a really thick, woody, old root system, these plants were like trees on the plains. They might not look very big above ground, but once they were in, they were there for decades. But of course, the Europeans brought their sheep, and they brought them in the millions. And this landscape had never exposed, unlike the Serengeti, had never been exposed to grazing animals in huge herds like this that had hard hooves. And so many of the plants disappeared relatively quickly, and the habitats changed for animals because they weren't exposed to this type of pressure. And that's a really important part of the story. As a consequence, much of the grasslands changed, became different. In some cases, it was lost altogether from the very high pressure of grazing. And some of this was also cultivation for crops. So as a consequence, grasslands tended to disappear from the Western Plains, and they were then restricted to areas that had avoided that intensive grazing pressure. So places like cemeteries. Cemeteries are good for remnant people, and they're also good for remnant ecosystems like grasslands. They were protected from that long history of being grazed by sheep or cows. And so some of our best examples of grasslands are now found in cemeteries because they've never been grazed. But critically, and what we're here to talk about today, is that many of our best grasslands occurred in another part of the landscape that rarely got grazed. Those 3-chain roadsides that crisscross Western Victoria that were travelling stock routes back in the day, but the grazing pressure would have been light because sheep were being moved from one place to another to go to market, and that was subsequently managed by members of the CFA and local communities to reduce fire risk. And it's this application of fire became really, really important to the long-term preservation and enhancement of the habitat quality of these areas. Because it was the fires that were frequently applied, which probably mimics something, not mimic, but certainly are more closely aligned to what must have been going on in the Plains country for at least the last 40,000 years through Aboriginal fire management and not much heavy grazing. Diprotodons and those megafauna were really big, but probably never herding like, cows are. And so frequent burning by roadsides by CFAs inadvertently was maintaining these really high quality ecosystems. In many instances, they're the only place we can find these in Western Victoria, is in these fantastic remnants on roadsides. The burning of grasslands is really compatible with their conservation. So burning is good for reducing fuel loads. It's good for making communities safe. But why it's really good for plants is because they tend to die back every summer. And if you don't burn them, the fuel loads accumulate a bit and they smother each other, the plants. And so they create suboptimal habitat. And we've known this for many years. So inadvertently, frequent burning had been maintaining an ecosystem that we weren't actually really aware was happening until, only the last couple of decades. But I want to tell you a little story. And it starts a bit like this. Burning doesn't destroy the grasslands, as I've been making out. It actually renews them. So here's the same roadside in Western Victoria down near Shelford. And on the left-hand side, it had been burnt in autumn. On the right-hand side, you can see just 4 or 5 months later, the rebounding of the ecosystem, the flowering, the fabulous grasslands that many of us are really attracted to, and they represent some of the best examples of the ecosystem. So it's entirely compatible to burn these sites and have your conservation of grasslands as well. And it's not just plants. Many of these fabulously burnt roadsides support some of the, they're some of the last places you can find high quality habitat for animals. So we've got a few animals here, legless lizards, but I like to point out the little dunarts here. These are related to Tassie devils. So they're our miniature little carnivores here. And so what we can do is we find dunarts in these high quality habitats because high quality habitats support lots of insects, lots of lizards, lots of food for a carnivore. So we're actually maintaining some of our natural heritage in these areas. Some plants can only now be found on roadsides that are burnt. The one on the right I've worked on for a long time is called the button wrinklewort. Shocking name, but now restricted primarily to roadsides and a couple of cemeteries. And without the help of that burning over the last many decades, that species would probably now be extinct. So we're really lucky to have these things still with us. Indeed, some species are so rare that we only know of them from one roadside. And this is a really good example of a roadside down near Dundonald in the Stony Rise country, to the south of Hamilton, I guess. Well, not to the south of Hamilton, south of Dunkeld. This species here was only described 25 years ago. Pterostylus basaltica. It's a type of greenhood orchid. And it's there because of the long-term burning of these roadsides. Here's another one with a terrible name, Spisser, if you like. Also found literally on the same roadside. Like Dundonald's got, some really nice roadsides. But it's not just Dundonald. Derranellum, the roadsides around there have been supporting species that are new to science, only described within the last 15 years. And you kind of think, how could that even be possible? That we've got to 2006 and we find new species. It's mostly because grasslands have been overlooked for the first 170 years of European settlement in Australia. And we've finally come to realise that there's all these special things tied up in high quality grasslands that have been managed by default for conservation by CFA. And so that's why we're concerned about changes to burning regimes. Just very, very quickly, why does this happen? Well, grasslands that get burnt frequently kind of look pictorially a bit like this. And that's a good thing. It allows lots of important things to happen. Plants to survive, animals to survive, things to regenerate, and it maintains really low fuel levels. That's actually a really good thing. In the absence of burning, grasslands get all choked up. And that's really bad for a whole bunch of things like little plants and little animals that don't like thick grasses. And as a consequence, the fuel loads go up a touch. So that's not a good outcome either. One of the really interesting things that's come to light, and many of us already know this, is that native grasslands tend to burn in a really different way to some of the exotic dominated grasslands. So on the left there, we've got a kangaroo grassland on the Dunkeld Cavendish Road being burnt, and we can see that the flame heights are pretty low and there's not much fuel. This gets burnt really frequently, really good grassland. On the top right though is a Phalaris dominated grassland. So the fuels are much more, there's much more fuel and they burn much more aggressively as a consequence. So there are benefits for maintaining native grasslands as well. We actually maintain lower fuel loads. Now, one of the questions we're going to talk about today is, well, when do we burn? So on the left, that's in summer. On the right, bottom right there, that's in spring. Much smokier and looks a bit rubbishy fire. But we need to start thinking about, well, when can we burn these things that suit brigades? Because the worst thing we can do is actually not burn them at all, I suspect, and we lose many of the values we're trying to protect. So that's probably it. The left there is a better outcome than that, I think, long term. We celebrate these roadsides and the contribution of community. So here's a roadside grassland sign just to the northwest of Dunkeld, and it highlights the really important grasslands in that area, which are a consequence of the fabulous work that brigades have been doing over many decades. Now, I understand that brigades aren't here to conserve grasslands, but their activities, which are entirely compatible with preservation of grasslands, have actually allowed us to retain this pioneering landscape, this landscape that goes back several millions of years. So I'm going to leave you with this slide here to appreciate the wee little plants of Western Victoria and what we actually are trying to prevent from losing. Because in many instances, these wee little plants don't really grow anywhere else other than in many of the places that we've been burning for decades now. So David, I'll end it there, and I've left a few minutes, I hope, to answer any questions if there are any.
Perfect timing. Thank you, John. Yes, we've got a few minutes if people have any questions. So I can't see any, Aggie, on the chat line. Have we got any questions there?
Yeah, there was one question from Jodie Honan just asking about that cool map that you had, John, with all the dates.
Yes. What was the question, Aggie?
Where's the cool map from?
Sorry, John. That's wondering where that map is. That you had all the dates from going from the Keilor Plains across the ages of the volcanoes.
what I can do, that comes out of a publication. I can share that and we can somehow get that round to the group if you like.
That would be great. Yep, that would be great.
Very good. Any more questions, do we think?
No, there aren't any other questions.
Right.
Good. As I say, I'm the warm-up act, Dave.
Well, you warmed us up well with those pictures of the fire anyway. But thanks, John.
Tony's just asked a question. Dave, Tony just has asked a question about timing of fire. I think, Tony, we're going to come back to that. So about maybe thinking about the timing. So that might be in our discussion just a little bit later. So if you can hang on, we'll talk about that. Thanks, Dave.
Okay,
thanks, everyone.
Right, well, we'll keep rolling and we might get the next speaker up. So Andy Govanstone is a Biodiversity Advisor for the CFA. He's talking about working within the current CFA guidelines. Andy's so currently the CFA Biodiversity Advisor for Western Victoria. He's been working with as a VMO for Districts 4, 5 and 6. Previous roles include Strategic Bushfire Planner with DELP, Grampians Region and Biodiversity Planner DELP Southwest. Been actively involved in native grassland management since the mid-1980s. Andy, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, and indeed a hard act to follow, John. Fantastic presentation, thank you. I also wish to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands of where we are gathered today. I'm on Gunditj Mara country in the southwest Victoria. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Tarrington Brigade Captain Matthew Linky, who took the photograph on the opening slide there, burning the Glenelg Highway on February 2020 last year. And as he was taking that photograph, Matthew was also being mentored as a burn controller by his father, the group officer for the Dundas Group, Everard Linky. So terrific example of passing on of burning skills from generation to generation. And with respect, I'd like to dedicate my presentation to all brigade elders and to the hundreds of volunteers who give their time every summer and their energies into the burning of our Western District Southwest roadsides to be making their communities safer. So thank you for what you do. Amy, can we have the slides brought up, please?
Yeah. Bear with me, I'm just not sure if you're getting the same view as I am, so I'll just try sharing again.
Okay, great, good to go. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Andy, slight delay.
Oh, wait here. It is a beautiful photograph. It's worth a good look. You can see all the tankers there, the quad bikes. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we are at this point today because of past developments. Now, before 1928, we had volunteer bushfire brigades informally scattered across the countryside. Landholders would purchase water carts, tankers, and with people that worked on their stations and locals, the labourers and things across the landscape would come together and come when the occasion called and work to put out bushfires. In 1928, the Bushfire Brigades Association was formed in Victoria to coordinate 106 independent brigades. In 1939, we had Victoria experienced its worst bushfire experience. Black Friday become known as Black Friday, over 5 million acres burnt, 3,700 buildings destroyed, 71 people died, and several towns were destroyed, obliterated. 5 years later, in 1943-44 summer, Black Saturday repeated a similar pattern, similar outcomes. And those two bushfires become the subject of Victoria's first Royal Commission into bushfires. And as a result of the deliberations and recommendations from that Royal Commission, the Country Fire Authority was established to coordinate and to provide a coordinated and cohesive firefighting agency outside of the central metropolitan area. The establishment of the Country Fire Authority was under the CFA Act of 1958. Now, of particular relevance to our discussion today, Section 43.1 of the CFA Act tells us that it shall be the duty of every municipal council and every public authority to take all practicable steps to prevent the occurrence of fires on and to minimise the danger of the spread of fires on or from any land vested in it or under its control or management, and more particularly for today's discussion, any highway, road, street, lane or thoroughfare, the maintenance of which is charged upon it. So it's important to appreciate that the CFA as an agency does not manage land. We implement works on behalf of land managers. So there is a difference there. Now, when we undertake works with the approval of land managers, they issue us with a Section 12 permit, which is also a road user consent permit. And that permit will have a number of conditions on it, and it might stipulate the timing that those works can be undertaken, such as in summer, or it might tell us that we will only burning fine fuels, not coarse fuels, that we will take measures to protect trees, or that we will have traffic control as a condition of undertaking those works. Now, with local government, they are required under Section 55 of the CFA Act to develop municipal emergency management plans. And the sub-plan of the emergency management plans are the municipal fire prevention plans, and they will identify roadsides where works will be undertaken. Likewise, with our highways, the Department of Transport have delegated responsibility for those, which they've given to Regional Roads Victoria, and they issue the CFA with Section 12 road user consent permits to undertake our burning activities. As I mentioned, it is a condition of our burning on roadsides that we have some kind of traffic management in place, depending upon the volume of traffic along that roadside, whether it's a highway or a byway. Environmental legislation is important to what we do. As John mentioned, went to considerable detail to mention that the roadsides that we burn on are frequently of high conservation value because of that burning, as a matter of fact, and that it is no surprise that the federal environment, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, is relevant to the management of many of those roadsides, that plant species or animal species and their communities that are listed on that schedule, on the EPBC schedule, do have conditions to protect, do have requirements to protect those species, and that we need to comply with those. The same with the Heritage Act, which is about protecting Indigenous conservation heritage in particular. There's a federal law and there's a state act as well. The state legislation that we need to work within is the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act and the Aboriginal Heritage Act of 2006. At the local government level, sometimes in their planning scheme they will have overlays that might identify trees in a particular part of the countryside or wetlands or something like that, that we also need to be cognizant of and work within. Here's a table showing 5 federal acts and 22 state acts that we need to be mindful of and work within when we undertake our activities. As far as the state acts, some of them are more pertinent than others, but we need to have them in mind and work within that legal framework when we undertake our activities. And in some instances, the fines for breaching those acts can be quite hefty, and we do not want to see our members or our organisation in the situation where they could be confronted with being subject to fines or legal ramifications through the activities that we undertake. As well as working with the requirements of other agencies, we also, from time to time, the state government will appoint a royal commission to investigate a matter, or the state may appoint an inquiry, a panel, to investigate some action. A recent one was the 2015 fire planned burn-off escape at Lancefield, Cobalt, where a fire escaped its containment lines and ended up burning houses and a considerable amount of property. The inquiry found that that planned burn was understaffed and poorly planned, and reading between the lines, that finding made the edict that thou shalt have a burn plan. And I'd highly have, with every confidence, say that burn plans are your friend. If you're involved in planned burning, burn plans are your friend. They are your safety net. They are your insurance if you follow that burn plan. They are prepared by qualified burn planners in consultation with brigade captains, with burn controllers, with the land manager themselves, and with values advisors. The checks and balances to make sure that that activity is compliant with the legislation that I outlined earlier is done by the burn planners in consultation with those key contributors. They are authorised by the Assistant Chief Fire Officer of the district, or if it's a more complex burn, by the Regional Deputy Chief Officer. They are your insurance. Just going back quickly to the Lancefield Cobalt inquiry, just admitting a few people here. Of their 22 recommendations that they made that were all adopted by the state and emergency agencies, was the need to better integrate burn planning and the operational implementation, and to provide sound governance, risk management and quality control. And also to ensure that stakeholders, our community members, beyond the immediate burn area are prioritised, and that communications is delivered in an active and meaningful way that suits the needs of those communities, that we do not operate in a vacuum. There were 2 audits undertaken, and one of them, the second audit, examined the implementation of recommendations from previous reports into escape burns between 2003 and 2015. That audit found in some cases reviews of planned burn escapes had not been undertaken, and that of the 189 recommendations made from those investigations that did take place, 23 of those recommendations had not been actioned. The auditors recommended stronger requirements to ensure burn escapes are investigated and that strict processes are in place to ensure the requirements are complied with. More significantly, as recent as this year, following the Black Summer bushfires of the 2019-2020 fire season, the Inspector General for Emergency Management Phase 1 investigation into community and sector preparedness gave 17 recommendations, and simultaneously the Victorian Auditor General's Office, Vago, their inquiry into reducing bushfire risk, of their 17 recommendations, 14 applied specifically to DELWIP and the CFA in relation to the management of fuel. So we need to take those recommendations on board and incorporate them into the way we do our business. As well as those, the Royal Commissions and the statewide inquiries, we have regional-based incident reviews. If something happens, something goes wrong, we need to learn from those experiences. And the learnings from those can be different. An inquiry, for example, in District 5, the implementation of the recommendations from that inquiry may have absolutely no bearing on another district or another region. So we do end up in the situation where different regions and different districts may have different prescriptions or guidelines, which personally I think is unfortunate. But for example, District 5 requires that mineral earth fire breaks on burns being undertaken in the restricted fire period. In the southwest, they require a minimum of 4 CFA tankers during the restricted fire period in a planned burn, whereas the west region can have a mix of private appliances and CFA appliances with a minimum of 2 CFA appliances. And the last example there is that our CFA head office, a working group, is clarifying what fit for purpose means in relation to private appliances. And I just want to speak briefly on that regarding dot point 4, is that in the southwest region, a volunteer requested clarification about the legal standing of a volunteer who was either driving or crewing on a private appliance. Did they have legal protection, insurance for their own safety if something went wrong? Now, head office have provided advice that that person is protected on a private appliance, provided they are current CFA members and the appliance is assessed as being fit for purpose. A working group has been established to provide guidelines to ensure that private appliances are confirmed as fit for purpose and that that fact is recorded. So we are working as an organisation to provide that clarification that was sought. In summary, we do not operate in a vacuum. We have legal obligations to obey the law like everybody else. We have royal commissions, audits, investigations and reviews that look into our business and the way we do those business, that undertake that business. We have standard operating procedures. For example, SOP 9.39 requires that the burning of all living vegetation requires a burn plan, and that applies statewide. We have regional and district internal incident reviews that can lead to region-wide or district-wide changes. And we have the land managers who we provide our services to. From time to time, they change their requirements, their directions, or their policies, and we need to work in with that. Last year, in the summer just gone, which was a very wet season in the southwest and also in the west, the wet season was late. The burning, because of the wet season, the burning started late. In the southwest, we didn't start burning until March, and it really hit its peak in May. So a very late season. Yet despite that, in the southwest region, there were over 1,700 hectares of roadsides burnt by volunteers and some 530 hectares in the western region. Now, the Burning Task Force, which has been established over the last couple of years, where volunteers from other areas volunteer their services to come and support burning brigades, was used to bolster local brigades to undertake that burning where required. Other things, other recent initiatives that have been brought, have developed to also support roadside burning is, I've mentioned the Planned Burning Task Force. The Southwest region recently produced a burn controller's handbook for low complexity burns with an accompanying kit folder. We undertake pre-season burn controllers briefings, and the CFA now pays contractors to prune trees and shrubs from fire breaks, which is an activity that was once undertaken by volunteers. Catchment commanders and vegetation management officers or support officers are in place to support brigade captains and burn controllers to do the legwork to help bring burning about. And in more recent times, DELWIP have initiated the Linear Reserve program where conservation priority roadsides payments are made to brigades for coordinating or participating in those burns. So there are some very positive changes happening to make things easier for brigades to be undertaking roadside burning, to support brigades. My role and the role of many other staff members of the CFA is to support brigades to undertake their activities. And I think that's it for me.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. We've got time for maybe a couple of questions. If and I think Aggie has just said to raise their hand if that helps. There was a question from John Del Pratt, wanted to know what area was burnt in the southwest in an average year. What burnt in the southwest in an average year?
Well, slightly more than that. It really depends. Sometimes it's too dry to be burning. So every year, it's a year-by-year event. I don't have an average figure, but I am happy to look that up and get back to you with that information, John. It would be good to have an average figure.
Okay. One more quick one. Stuart McCallum asked, where's it gone? Do you have to know the local ecology before you start burning?
Well, the assumption is that you have a burn plan, Stuart, and that assessment of at least a basic assessment of the qualities of that site will have been undertaken. I know with each proposed burn, there is a values check done where databases, the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, the EPBC database are checked for that site, for every proposed burn site, cultural heritage check, and that information is fed into the burn plan.
Yep, thanks, Andy. And last question we'll have at this moment from Marshall Flyer. Does the timing of the burns account for the seeding of species?
Yeah, generally the burning begins around the new year and goes through until the autumn break, sometimes after the autumn break. So yes, that is the preferred time to be burning. But as John indicated earlier, if an area is long unburnt, we would rather see it being burnt, even if it's in winter or even spring, as a one-off, just to get the biomass opened up, reduced, and then to go back into a summer burning pattern. So the ecologists are advising us that we would rather see a long unburnt site burnt when it can be burnt, rather than let it continue to go rank.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Andy. We might keep moving. Also, I just want to remind people that this event is being recorded, so we should have access to all the videos from it. Next speaker is Dr. Ben Zeeman. Ben is a Senior Biodiversity Officer for Glenelg Hopkins CMA, and he's talking about burning trends in the southwest Victoria. Ben's a Senior Biodiversity Officer with the Glenelg Hopkins CMA on the VVP recovery project. He also completed a PhD in Trobe University, researching long-term change in the vegetation of native grasslands across the VVP. So, Dr. Ben, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, David. I'm assuming that my screen is currently sharing. People can see that.
Looks good. Yep.
Looks good. Cool. All right. So I'm going to present the results of a survey that we undertook late last year, where we asked CFA volunteers across Southwest Victoria about their views on roadside burning. And so we wanted to understand how roadside burning is changing, given the implications that this has for native grasslands. And these volunteer brigades are also central to the rural community's capacity to manage fire risk and respond to emergencies. And we know that they've been burning these roadsides in Southwest Victoria since at least the 1930s. And that's been critical for managing or for maintaining these high quality and critically endangered grasslands, which are largely restricted to these regularly burnt roadsides. However, there is evidence that roadside burning is in decline, and this is happening as climate change is expected to increase fire risk across Victoria. So the decline in roadside burning is a major biodiversity issue, but it's also an issue for community safety regarding fire. So John has already spoken about why fire is so important for the ecology of native grassland. So I won't spend too much time on this slide other than to say that these high quality grasslands are becoming increasingly rare. 99% of it has been cleared, but there are these linear areas of high quality grassland in the landscape that have resulted from community burn-offs. So CFA volunteers have been probably the most important grassland managers we've had over the past century, but we need to recognise that grassland conservation is not the primary driver for these burns. They've largely occurred to protect communities from fire. So to understand how roadside burning is changing, what the factors are that both enable and hinder burning, what it motivates people to participate in the burns, we developed this social survey that we sent out to CFA volunteers late last year. And the focus was on volunteers in districts 4, 5, 6 and 16, which capture the rural distribution of the Victorian volcanic plain in Southwest Victoria. We ended up getting 131 volunteers complete this survey, which had 10 questions and we also provided people with the ability to provide further comments to the questions that we raised. And we found that people were generally highly engaged with this and did provide us with extensive comments. So one of the things we asked was whether brigade participation in roadside burning was changing. And 57% of volunteers said that it was in decline. And a typical comment to this I've included here is what people would say when we asked this question was that we used to burn approximately 14 kilometres of roadside each summer, but this hasn't happened for at least 20 years. We also had 20% state that their brigade does not participate in roadside burning. 18 said that things hadn't really changed much, but we just had 2% that said it was increasing. We also found that roadside burning was more likely to be in decline in areas where burns were not seen as important for protecting towns, or when people didn't believe that the timing of burnings was actually serving to protect assets. Many also commented on increases in regulation in admin over time, as well as the decline of volunteer numbers. So, example of this is this final comment, this quote down the bottom. An increase in procedure and regulation has made roadside burning a complex and onerous task for volunteer brigades to carry out. And so the decline in CFA volunteer numbers over time is a statewide issue. So this here is data from the CFA annual report dating back to 1988. And you can see that over this period, we've seen a 20% decline in volunteer numbers over the past 30 years. And there's been an operational decline in numbers of 10% just in 2020 alone. And these are some of the comments that people provided on this issue. So it's getting harder to get people to volunteer their time. We struggle to find members to participate in roadside burning at the most suitable time of year. Roadside burning is becoming difficult as the local population declines and ages. Now, for the next few slides, I'm going to be presenting data using these frequency distribution plots. These are an effective way of interpreting social data. Where you see a single peak, it's indicating public consensus on a question, whereas two peaks will indicate public conflict. But the overall responses are then determined by the mean, and these are based on 7-point Likert scales. But I'm just going to point out the main points. I'll walk through the main points here. If you'd like to look at this in more detail, we're happy to share the report with you that this comes from, so just get in touch with us and we can send that on. So this slide is looking at the factors that are currently in place to assist volunteers in undertaking roadside burning. And this includes things like maintaining and installing fire breaks, providing traffic control, pruning back trees and shrubs, providing additional people and vehicles, and covering volunteer costs. And overall, all of these factors tended to be received by the people that participate in the survey as being considered very, very useful when they're undertaking their burns. The one thing that came out in the comments that many raised was the need for greater assistance with admin. So we had comments like this: someone to assist brigades with the process to apply and follow through on planned burns. Now, we understand that the CFA can actually provide brigades with admin support through the vegetation management officers, but it seems that many people were actually unaware of this process. When it came to resourcing within the brigades, volunteers tended to consider themselves very well resourced in knowledge and experience. Equipment trended towards being considered well resourced, but again, it was people resourcing that was considered the main issue, with brigades considering themselves only somewhat resourced when it came to people. So an example here from this quote: knowledge is not the problem, manpower is a constant problem due to fewer active members and increased workloads. And in the comments to this question, people also highlighted the importance of the support that they receive in neighbouring brigades when they're undertaking their burns. So help from neighbouring brigades is essential. We asked people about the factors that motivate them to participate in roadside burning, and this included things such as the protection of assets and communities, social motivators such as spending time with and connecting with others in the community, historical motivations, so maintaining the work that previous generations had put in place, as well as the ecological motivations such as maintaining the native grasslands. And not surprisingly, protecting assets and the community, so things like livestock, crop and towns, are all considered to be very important. And although the protection of native grasslands wasn't the primary motivator for burning, 82% of people still considered it to be at least somewhat important, and 27% considered it to be very important. Another thing that came up here that we didn't ask about specifically, but we probably should have, was that many also raised the importance of roadside burning as a training exercise. So for example, this quote down the bottom here: roadside burning provides a good training opportunity and allows new members to be exposed to grass fire in a controlled environment. And based on the number of people that raised this in the survey, we suspect it would have received a very important response. We also asked volunteers about the factors that are preventing brigades from undertaking roadside burning. For this, the perception that environmental law was a barrier received a bit of a conflicting response. People either strongly agreed that it was a barrier to getting the burns done, or they strongly disagreed that it was a barrier. A lack of people and time were again mentioned often. For example, this quote here: often the best time to burn coincides with peak time for harvesting, or with that very brief break following when farming families try to have a few days at the beach. It's rare that all roadside burning is able to be achieved. And then the comments, people again raised the issue of admin regulations. There was, however, strong disagreement with the statement that burns weren't effective at reducing fire risk. So volunteers do believe that these burns work. So going back to environmental law, 66% of people considered environmental law a barrier and 40% strongly considered a barrier. And so this quote here is sort of an example of that. Often the law is not in sync with the practicality of what we see out here. However, the belief that environmental law was a barrier was poorly correlated with the amount of knowledge that people then believed they actually had of environmental law. And those that consider themselves to know a great deal about environmental law were less concerned about the impact it has on burning. And so, for example, this second quote down here, current environmental law, the EPBC Act and the FFG Act are compatible with roadside burning. However, there were some issues raised that may put volunteers in conflict with environmental law, depending on whether or not the areas they're talking about are places where native grasslands are present. So an example of that could be this last quote. We have been spraying the roadsides in our brigade area. An important finding that came out of the survey was that volunteers overwhelmingly believe that native grasslands on roadsides present a lower fire risk compared to Phalaris dominated roadsides. So 78% believe that native grasslands are safer, 20% were unsure, and only 2% believe that Phalaris was safer. So Phalaris tends to be the main non-native species found on roadsides in Southwest Victoria. And we received a lot of comments like this one here. Phalaris is the enemy when burning roadsides. Almost every breakaway can be attributed to Phalaris heads. It makes burning very slow to be safe. Shorter native veg will burn to the break and rarely get over. And this belief that native grasslands pose a reduced fire risk compared to Phalaris dominated roadsides is consistent with the science, with Phalaris accumulating higher levels of biomass, burning more intense and producing far more unpredictable fire behaviour. So roadside burning not only helps to keep fuel loads down, but it also conserves this far less fire-prone vegetation type to create these green fire breaks through the landscape. When we asked people about when they believe it's best to undertake roadside burning, we did notice a shift from when burning has occurred historically. So historically, burning often would occur through late summer and early autumn. But looking at this graph here, I've plotted with the red line the time of year people believe it's best to undertake roadside burning. And then in the grey broken line is when most native plants in the grasslands are flowering. So ideally for grassland management, burning is best to be undertaken after plants have had a chance to flower and set seed. But here we can see a peak in when burning is preferred by volunteers, largely coinciding with most species are flowering in spring. Now, from a volunteer perspective, burning early means that those fuel loads can be reduced prior to the fire season, but also provides an opportunity to refresh people's skills. An example of that is the first quote I've got here, so that they can act as a summer fire break, while at the same time refreshing member skills ahead of the main fire danger period. There were still some people that preferred the later season burning, and they identified the need for grass curing to ensure an effective burn. So an example of that, the second quote, fuel loads need to be cured 100%, so the summer months are required to cure the fuel loads. And then we had some people that still preferred burning sort of later in autumn, and a combination of having cured grass, low fire danger, and personnel available to undertake the burns were considered important. So April, end of fire season, once the real fire danger period has passed, could be a good time to burn and clean up heavy, dense fuel locations in the region. So when volunteers prefer to burn, it may depend a little bit on fuel type, as some of them raised in the survey. So an example of that, many of the roadsides that are now dominated by Phalaris, and they do have little conservation value, these areas tend to cure much earlier in the season. So an early season burn may be effectively reducing fuel loads, and it may not have a huge ecological cost. It may not have any ecological cost at all. Whereas kangaroo grass, which tends to be the dominant species in areas of native grassland, does generally start to cure a little bit later, so more sort of midsummer. So burning later in the season may be more effective at reducing fuel in the native grasslands. And burning later also helps to conserve these areas and help maintain that less fire-prone vegetation in the landscape. So to conclude, roadside burning has long played a critical role in involving the community in bushfire management and promoting engagement and awareness of bushfire risk. It's also played a critical role in conserving these high-quality areas of native grassland. However, the extent of roadside burning that occurs each year is in decline. Respondents to the survey identified increases in regulation and admin, and coupled with a decline in volunteer numbers as key drivers of that decline. However, volunteers still consider roadside burning as critical for community and safety and protecting assets from fire. And burning roadsides to protect native grassland was considered at least somewhat important by most volunteers, and 27% considered it to be very important. Volunteers also overwhelmingly believe that native vegetation poses a lower fire risk than non-native vegetation, providing another important reason for protecting these native grasslands. We are seeing, though, a preference towards burning earlier in the fire season, and this has been driven by time constraints and the view of reducing fuel loads prior to the fire season. So we're now looking to actually, well, we don't have a great, we want to understand the ecological impact of that better. So we're sort of setting up some plots now to work at the CFA to actually look at this in more detail, what the ecological response will be of starting to move those burns earlier into the season. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was fantastic. Boy, there's a lot of really good information there. Really, really important messages as well. Now, Aggie, I'm afraid I've taken my eye off the screen a bit. Do we have any questions?
Yes, there are a few, Dave. I'm just going back through them. So we've had the timing of burns. Okay, so questions from
Kevin Marr.
Yeah, yeah, maybe work upwards.
Does fire help with germination?
Yeah, it probably not so much germination. It provides space though. So one of the big issues with native grasslands is competition from the native grasses themselves. But having a fire in there, it opens up all the space where those subordinate, less competitive species can get opportunities and get space to come up through. So it provides the space required for those plants to come up, rather than so much stimulating a seed bank.
Okey-doke, thanks, Ben. Any others there, Aggie?
Yeah, there's a comment from Stephen Kerwood about using the VBA records and the EPBC protected matters tool in preparing burn plans. So it's a more comment. I wanted to comment that these desktop tools are often crude assessment tools when it comes to identifying biodiversity values of a site. I wouldn't rely on these to determine risks, benefits to biodiversity for planned burns. Yep, and this is all great stuff for the upcoming Q&A session too. As far as questions go, that's...
Yeah, we did have one from John about wanting a comment on is annual burning sometimes not sufficient to properly control the flammable biomass of Phalaris-dominated roadsides? Did you have a comment on that, Ben? Do you think annual burning is...
Annual burn, yeah, so there are some roadsides that have annual burning and they have pretty good grasslands on them, but it's probably when those annual burns occur. So if it's happening sort of late summer, autumn, when all the natives have done their thing, then annual burning is probably okay. But if we are looking at moving to earlier season spring burning, we are probably sacrificing a bit of seed in that process. So in that instance, you probably would want to reduce the frequency of burning. So you might sacrifice, plant reproduction 1 year, but then you don't burn it for the next year. So then it has an opportunity then for the plants to come up through. As far as reducing Phalaris goes, well, I suppose the more you burn Phalaris, the more you're reducing biomass. Probably the volunteers themselves have a better idea as to how effective they're finding reducing Phalaris using fire.
It takes a lot of knocking down from my experience.
Yeah.
Many years, and that's certainly the experience at Murrumong too, where I was involved for a while. Yeah, it's a good weed when it needs to be in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Look, and just remind people that this will be recorded, and we can access the reports and things later. And we might keep moving, and you can also put more questions in your chat, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the next talk. But I'd like to introduce now Mark Gubbins, who's a farmer from Chatsworth, and he's the Westmere Group Burning Controller, lamb and beef producer, and he's a DGO with the Westmere Group and's been involved in burning roads since the mid-70s. So, Mark, over to you.
Thanks, David, and hello to everyone out there. As David said, my experience is from the Westmere Group of the CFA, but more significantly, the Chatsworth Fire Brigade. The Westmere Group, just to give you a bit of background, is 18 fire brigades from Chatsworth, Warndoo, Dundonald in the south, across to Bournes Hill, Wallora, along the western side, which goes along the Grampians, and to the north with Tattayune, Yellow Waipura, Stoneleigh, and then Caramballoch and Pura in the east. It's a big area for us to look after, but and we are an immensely proud group of how we operate and what we can achieve. I have been worried about burning, that it's been declining, and not been vocal, but trying to work out how to re-establish some burning. Got the job of the Westmere Group planned burn coordinator this last year, a new position that hasn't been about before. So I hope I can do some good, but let's see how we go with that. Firstly, I'd like to go back into the past, David, to this, what I think is the start of roadside burning. And it goes back to 1944, Black Saturday, and there was a fairly threatening fire in this area. And with lots of people away at the war effort, it frightened communities. When people started to arrive back from the war, they got together and decided to burn the roadsides to create fire breaks to help protect the communities and have bare strips to fight fire against. I know this much because my grandfather was one of those instigating these burns, and my father was on the early burns as a young boy. Just the roads I'm talking about, the Chatsworth roads, Chatsworth Warndoo Road, Chatsworth Hexham Road, Chatsworth Karamat Road, Chatsworth Wycliffe Road. I imagine burning at the same time also took place at surrounding areas and maybe even all over Victoria. I don't know. Black Saturday was a very, very big event, as we've read about. There was no modern equipment, very little, if any, water appliances. They used beaters, which were strong canvas webbing strapped to a long handle to control the fire, and I imagine a lot of hard work. These roads were burnt as early as they could be to give the best possible protection before the season became too dry. After that, fires became much harder to control when it was drier. They were burnt every year from 1945, except in the very bad drought years of 1967, 1983, 2006. 70 plus years until recently, since burning has become more intermittent. There were no rules and regulations, just sensible, safe, common sense practices. The biggest unknown benefactor of this roadside burning was native vegetation. Have a look at roadsides that have never been burnt and see what you find. Introduced species, severely degraded natural native vegetation, fire regardless of timing and frequency, has been the best protection of Australian native vegetation to this day in this region. David Allen and I did an intensive study of what the Westmere Group burned annually as a group in 2013. 483 kilometres of roadsides were burnt voluntarily. This was at a group commitment of $351,000 at the time, if it had been charged out at contract rates for time, labour, machinery, water, because we all supplied that as well, fuel for the burning, and for the machines that were there to help. This was all donated by the local community. Today, I estimate this would be more than $500,000 of community commitment to do the same job. That's $1,000 a kilometre. If we don't do it, who else is going to pay for that? It won't get done, and the native vegetation will dwindle. Communities will be less secure in the dangerous summer months. But let's move to the present, where we are today. The last few years, we've got to the stage of much less burning. In 2020, the Westmere Group only burnt 10 or 20 kilometres, partly due to the green summer, but this can't be blamed. It's probably more of an excuse. This roadside burning has been dwindling for the last 3 to 5 years. This decline in burning activity has been to increased regulation, decreased manpower, change of farming activity from livestock to cropping, which requires an intense farming activity, harvest, during peak burning times. The timing is labour conflicting. And then everyone wants to go on holiday. And if you've ever been part of a harvest crew over the Christmas, New Year period, you'd also want to go on holiday. This is one of the many reasons burning is declining, lack of manpower. But it's so much more than that. It's about timing of burning. Somehow, the 1st of January got into our burn plans as a start date. We need to burn earlier than this. And please understand that we go all the way up towards Ararat. It dries off there a lot quicker than Hamilton and South. We need to burn earlier for reasons that it provides our strategic breaks and to get the manpower before it gets on harvesters. I'm talking from a change of the season. I'm talking about from the change of the season as early as October in some years, and we did that throughout the years. Considering that the best native vegetation roadsides were burnt constantly for a period of over 70 years, whenever we could rally a burn team, is a testament to the value of letting us burn whenever we can get teams to be organised. The Westmere Group, like many other, burns roadsides to create fire breaks to protect the community in which we live. That's our motivation. It is a fantastic training exercise and gets the CFAs and landholders' private appliances out to be tested in readiness early in the fire season, most important. It's also the greatest live training exercise for firefighting that there is, as close as you can get to the very frightening real thing. Regulation has limited us to less burnable days. The common sense approach we took up until the early 2000s has gone with an array of rules and regulations. Wind, less than 15 kilometres. Temperature, less than 32 degrees. Relative humidity, greater than 30%. FDI, max 8. Sadly, the days of the common sense finger in the air or hold up the handkerchief to test the conditions have gone to today's long list of compliance. And yes, Andy, I understand why, but it's making it a lot harder. Whoever wrote these rules has probably never been part of a roadside burn. It's actually far safer to burn with 26 degrees Celsius at 20 kilometres of wind, but modern regulation totally forbids that. What a burn controller has to today far exceeds his pay grade. He is a volunteer. I recently read a modern day burn plan. I hadn't read one for quite some time because I wasn't doing that part of the job. I probably wouldn't be bothered burning today. Notifications, just to be able to light up, you've got to make 4 phone calls to make sure you've got permission. Now, 4 phone calls is not much, but what about the countless hours of phone calls trying to convince crews to turn up? And you have to do that. You have to convince them to come. They don't just rock up. You have to really, really try hard to get people to turn up. Timing of burning, as I said, our burning dates, start dates have been pushed later and later. The country cures at different times from the north to the south. Flexibility is required. There is no fire prevention benefit for late season burning, in my opinion. Maybe one of the if that's what's wanted, maybe one of the bureaucratic bodies out there can pay the $1,000 a kilometre to get it done. Remember why a CFA volunteer is involved in roadside burning, to put in strategic breaks early in the season to protect its community, property, and fight fires against. We don't do it for fun. We don't even enjoy doing it. We do it for our community's protection. Early burning is safer as it is not as dry, not as hot. I stress again, it gets volunteers out practicing their skills for a wildfire event. Test the gear, CFA and private, in readiness for an ongoing season. And most important of all, it provides a valuable training experience. Sadly, at this time, that is not recognised as a CFA eligible training module. How can you have the best training ground that is the closest to the real thing and not give volunteers recognition for it? That makes absolutely no sense to me. Another issue becoming apparent today, and it was highlighted by Andy, is the regulation of the CFA tankers requirement. This is to do with the red tankers out of the CFA shed. It got changed a few years back from 1 to 2 in the Westmere Group, and I thought it was 5 in the other groups, but Andy says 4. To organise this just takes more time and volunteers, but I'll come back to that a bit. Considering, and I can talk about the Westmere Group because I know the stats, the Westmere Group has over 100 heavy private tankers, plus many lighter firefighting appliances. This is a ridiculous ruling. If it comes about, it will kill firebreak burning, having all these CFA tankers when there's that much private gear out there. Westmere Group has over 15 private appliances to 1 CFA tanker. Many of these are decommissioned CFA tankers, privately owned and maintained. And that is a lot of water for the task. Traffic control, becoming harder and harder. There's a lot more traffic on our roads. GPS is taking people on roads they didn't even know existed. The amount of caravans that are shortcutting via GPS is staggering. All this is making traffic control at burning harder. It's a problem. Yes, we can get help on major roads, but minor roads are a problem. And we need to be able to easily close them without politics for burning exercises. Just shut the things completely. Yeah, I can hear people out there going, you can't do that. Well, I think we need to do it. And why should a volunteer have to stand at the end of the road and tell someone to wait or go around to only get abused? Maybe someone paid should do all that job, but who's going to pay that? Rural communities are fragile. They're bruised easily. Powers that be need to be careful. Don't rule us with a stick. Educate instead, but be careful not to lecture. The Karamat burning disaster should never have happened. And for those that don't know what I mean by that, that is when in 2019, the Karamat Brigade lined up, ready to burn their fire breaks with 1 CFA tanker and all their private units and all their manpower on one of the best days of the year to burn. A paid CFA person came out of Hamilton and would deny them the ability to burn. It totally destroyed that community's ability to want to go out again and burn. And I would think Karamat will probably never burn a roadside. That could have been handled so differently. And they could have burnt their roads and then talked about the problem. The Wycliffe Road overspray, in which, to highlight that, a son came home to his father's property and was asked to go and spray the roadside ready in preparation for the fire season. And he sadly opened his boom a bit wide and sprayed into the native grassland. Mind you, I say native grassland, I can remember in the 70s when that whole road was being ploughed as a fire break. Probably shows how resilient some of these native plants are, because they came back after that. He made a mistake. People came out of Canberra to charge them with a $78,000 fine to reclaim. It's sitting in abatement at the moment, hoping that the native species will come back. But that was harsh. That went into the community and people thought, I am not going to burn again if that's the way we're going to be treated. Things like Simon Armitage from Sierra Group being threatened by police with a charge for doing a roadside burn in May. For heaven's sake, what a great way to piss off a roadside burning community. My understanding is CFA staff are paid staff, are meant to be there to assist volunteers, and most of you do a fantastic job of that. But it seems someone in Region 5 is trying to undermine the volunteer system. That head should roll. You don't put members under this sort of pressure. It's not on. It doesn't help the whole volunteer system. To the do-gooders and the dobbers out there, you don't help. You give the community a sour taste. Take a better stance than that. Come and help us. To the seed harvesters, we know you want native seed for your business, but don't whinge and complain that we just burnt your seed bed. We've actually played a big part in maintaining it for you. Come and help and gain some community respect, and you'll most likely get exactly what you want. All these events leave a sour taste in the mouths of those that do the work, and they talk to their neighbours, their neighbouring brigades, and they spread the word that they're being punished for doing the wrong thing. It's not helping the cause of roadside burning and total membership of the CFA. And to that, the young are not joining up like we used to. It's too hard, too much paperwork, too much regulation. You'll find them on the back of a private tanker at a fire. They'll help extinguish, and then they're gone. They're not interested in all the BS. You can't beat experience, but it needs encouragement, not the instances I've just highlighted. Letters of threat for accidental or minor violations give brigade members a bad taste. Yes, people need to do the right thing, but talking is better than threatening. Educate. Remember, everyone that has burnt these roadsides for the last 70 years are volunteers. They don't get paid. They give their time freely and they rarely complain. But they're starting to walk away. They say it's too hard, can't be bothered. And the harder bureaucracy makes it, the harder it's going to be for communities to continue burning roadsides. So to the future, burning has been dying. It may already be dead. John, I'm sorry, but we need to do something different to change it. So Westmere Group is going to try this year and maintain some strategic breaks. We're going to take a different view of how to do it. We're going to attempt to burn in strike teams, burning in with multiple strike teams on single roads to get them done quickly, efficiently, and then move to another road. Hopefully we can close all but major roads to be able to do that, because we will have a lot of activity in one place at one time, but it won't be there for very long. We're going to use the burning task force, hopefully, to assist with this in manpower, but we still need the local knowledge. That is very important. Now, I know everyone wants burning to continue, or may I say reignite, because it's stalled. But we need to be able to burn what and when we want with minimal regulation. I know regulation's got to be there, but we need it minimised to sensibility, and we need all the help we can get. Early burning puts in the strategic breaks, and that's what we are about. The ground hasn't dried out, pasture's still green, it's safer, we can move faster, and we can get the job done. Now, let me mention spraying. Yes, chemicals. I know it's scary. We all hate sprays, but they have a place in controlling weeds in this modern weed-changing world. Think about strategic spray topping would be an ideal solution for phalaris control. 1, to control seed set so it doesn't spread for you. 2, drying it out for an early burn event. Phalaris hangs on late into the season and doesn't burn well when green. Phalaris has been shown in photos before as the most frightening grass to burn when tall, dry and mature. And sorry, the current spot spraying practices you're doing are not working that well. Phalaris is getting away. A different approach needs to be looked at, but that's out of my league. Training. The CFA has to recognise burning activities and a training module for firefighting skills. There is nothing better and closer to the real thing. The only difference is that it's organised and less frightening, and so much better than a classroom. It's hands-on. I'm not eliminating the classroom, but they should go hand in hand. So David, in summary, we need early burning. to burn what we can within the conditions. Regulation needs to be easy and not time consuming. And yes, I get VMOs are there to help. And finally, remember, we are not paid. We do this for nothing. We put in valuable personal time, equipment, fuel and water. If we won't do it, it won't get done. If burning stops, I give it 10 to 15 years and the native grasslands will be overrun with foreign species. Native vegetation is the unknown benefactor of roadside burning activities. Thanks, David.
Right, thank you, Mark. That's great. You've touched on all the major points there, I think, certainly from the local brigade point of view. So once again, Aggie, I've taken my eye off the ball a bit in terms of the questions. Do we have any questions, or maybe we could, at this stage, we could just perhaps open it up to the whole panel. If anyone's got any questions, we can start to wind it down into the Q&A session. We've still got 30 minutes of time booked, so we've got plenty of time for questions. How are we going?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of questions and comments coming from your presentation, Mark, which is great. Maybe if we have a couple specific to Mark's presentation, Dave.
Yep.
So there was, and I think these all will come up in the Q&A session, but John Del Pratt asked about, are we looking at more effective biomass control of Phalaris? We may need to include councils in this. And another question about Phalaris from Deirdre, is it a better option to spray the Phalaris 1 year and then burn the next, etc.? But this might be something that we sort of tease out in the Q&A session. So maybe, Mark, if you've obviously had some ideas about Phalaris, if you maybe want to say something about that before we sort of open up into the Q&A session.
Well, I've watched the Phalaris growing throughout our roadsides, as many would have seen, and I believe that some sensible spray topping early in the spring to dry out its seed head, to dry it out so we can give it a good early burn would be very, very beneficial. And then you come in with your spot spraying if there's some summer rain to actually give it a second go. I think that'd be really beneficial. I'm not talking about spraying native grasslands. I'm talking about strategic spraying areas so that we hopefully can get some control of it on the roadsides, make it easier to burn, because as I said, it is a frightening damn thing when it goes up in the middle of summer. And if roadsides are never burnt again and it's all Phalaris, heaven help us what we'll end up with.
Yes, I concur, Mark, certainly. And I know the Shire, to answer Deirdre Andrews' question, have been attempting to wick wipe a number of those sort of high intensity areas of Phalaris for a number of years, and I don't know that it's reduced it much, but it certainly helps to quell the Phalaris biomass prior to burning, so that is helpful, but it's a pretty tough old weed and it keeps on coming back. So wick wiping is another version of spraying, and it's strategic because you're only attacking that plant itself, so that's very beneficial. What else, Aggie?
There's questions. Sandy Thompson from North Hamilton Fire Brigade is asking about, or I suppose commenting on that she totally concurs with what Mark has been saying for the North Hamilton Brigade, and asking about getting around requirements for mineral earth breaks when sprayed breaks are just as effective in certain circumstances. So this might actually be more an Andy Gov question. So I'm not sure if Amy is online and if we want to, well, Andy, if you want to maybe respond to that one. I suppose maybe we open it up to the Q&A session, do we?
Yeah.
It's that time of proceedings. The dilemma about having a strip of sprayed, dried, dead vegetation between the area that's going to be burnt and the adjoining fence line. I'm not sure if that would make a fire break. The advantage of a mineral earth fire break is that you have a fuel-free zone. I think just spraying a strip of vegetation, unless you do it really early before it gets a chance to grow, and often then it's too wet to get on to do the spraying, you'll have a strip of dry fuel between the burn area and the fence line. So I'm not sure if that would serve the purpose. If you were burning outside the summer season, outside the fire restricted period after the autumn rains, I guess that would be different.
Andy, I can also comment or add to that perhaps a little bit.
Yep.
The blokes out of Dundonald do an amazing job, because you just can't get a plough out there because it's all solid rock and there's no mineral earth to be seen. So it's a sprayed sort of line, and they have got rock walls fences made of rocks to help them a little bit in some areas, but there are different areas where mineral earth breaks are impossible to have.
Yep.
But they still do an amazing job burning. You know, they get across those rocks and the barriers, and they do an extraordinary job. And as John pointed out before, that those two extremely rare plants are the beneficiary of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one thing we could throw in there, Andy, is that if we were to consider burning at different times, maybe the need for a mineral break is less necessary if you're burning a bit earlier in the season, because the vegetation is going to be green, or greener anyway.
Yeah, I agree. It's about having a fuel-free zone between the fire and the fence lines, the private property. Yep.
We had a question for Ben or John. From an ecological perspective, what is a healthier burning regime for a Demeter-dominated grassland? Burning annually in late summer, autumn, or burning biannually in spring and alternating to autumn?
Probably the ideally, so the ideal burning would be later in the season, and that's not for the Demeter itself, but everything else. So everything else will have flowered, set seed, and died back to dormant tubers sort of around Christmas time down here. So you have burns that go through in autumn. None of that vegetation that might potentially be sensitive to fire is going to be exposed to fire. It's all sitting below the soil surface where it's protected. However, having it done early in spring is a much better outcome than not burning at all, because otherwise you're just going to get this accumulation of Demeter thatch over time. Nothing will recruit. You give it enough time, the Demeter will even smother out itself. You'll see the ecosystem crash, and that's when Phalaris will come in and colonise. So I did optimally, of course, burn later in the season, but that might not be an option because the brigades just don't have the capacity to do that for the amount of roadsides that we'd like to get burned as well. That's why we're thinking that this earlier season burning is better than not burning at all. And if you're doing it less frequently, you're still providing an opportunity for those plants to sprout and set seed in those years where you don't burn.
Dave, I'll point out Sean Carter has had his hand up for quite some time, so we might need to let Sean, I don't know, we might need to unmute him first.
You've got the ability to unmute yourself now, Sean, if you want to ask a question.
I suppose change tack a bit. I want to go back into the functionality of actually burning. We have worked with the CFA before in getting burns done and providing resources to assist CFA in getting burns done. I suppose in my experience, the vegetation officers with CFA are the ones that create the burn plans. And I suppose it's the burn plans that get signed off from an insurance perspective by both parties. But there seems to be a disconnect between local CFA groups the vegetation officer and I suppose in this case, which is Vic Roads or Department of Transport. So we, a while back, used to do burning with CFA quite a bit, and essentially we stopped after a burn occurred at Gumbaya Park, where the CFA or I suppose the vegetation plan or the burn plan required the burn to occur with the fine fuel moisture under 15%. Previously, we hadn't had that, and we'd burnt in autumn, September. Is there an opportunity for local brigades to work with their vegetation officers more closely to ensure that those restrictions aren't in place? Because essentially what happened was we ended up the agreement is the CFA come through, they start the fire, they monitor the fire. When they think it's safe, they hop up and leave. And then I suppose we engage resources into monitoring, I suppose, the fire or the burnt area after the fact. Because the soil moisture was so low, we had spot fires in that area for the next 14 days. So I was just wondering if the CFA brigades are able to work closer with their vegetation officers to ensure the burn plan, because I suppose previously the traffic management, the road closures, and the sign-off in the Department of Transport can be done by the environmental officers. We just need, I suppose, better communication between local brigades and vegetation officers.
Yeah, Sean, I didn't quite catch what it is that you do.
Oh, sorry. I work with the Department of Transport, and previously I've been involved in roadside management. And during that time, I suppose anywhere from grass cutting to hazardous tree removal to, I suppose, weed spraying, that sort of stuff.
Yep. I think everything becomes a lot easier when you have good communications. In the lead up to a burn, it is essential that the vegetation management officers and the catchment commanders work with the brigade captain or the burn controller to make sure that everybody knows what the plan is, the objectives, why the brigade want to burn it, what the objective is, and what's the best way to achieve, what's the prescription that's going to achieve that objective. Now, unfortunately, in the CFA, like in all organisations, not everybody operates at the same skill level. And I think some of the things that Mark referred to before can be related to inadequate communications and not people operating at different levels of experience. Now, unfortunately, that's the reality that we work in. People, when they come on board, they may not have the skills that we would wish they had. People's skill levels differ. That's the reality of any organisation, and the CFA is no different. But good, effective, open communications, a good relationship between the players can avoid, can pave the way for good outcomes. It's essential, and I would love to see more of it. So I don't know if that helps. I mean, I think Mark used the term before. It's more of an excuse than a I don't know, whatever it was. It was a good line anyway, Mark.
Okay.
But look, I don't know if I can help you anymore, Sean, but I just cannot stress enough the importance of good, regular communications between the key players.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Mark's got his hand up. Mark.
Just Sean, I'd just like to comment on something you said, that the CFA, and I don't know where you're from and it doesn't really matter, but the CFA lit a roadside or fire and then left you to it for 14 days and you had to deal with spot fires. Certainly that's not what most of us do. I don't know how that took place. I mean, if
I suppose,
me as a
Mark, the agreement we had in place is the CFA are volunteers, and we understand that they're volunteers. However, our insurances don't allow us to, I suppose, light fires. So we need someone to light the fires for us. And I mean, look, we get excellent maintenance outcomes from roadside burning, regardless of whether it's ecological or fuel reduction. I suppose when you mow the grass as often as we do, roadside burning works. You do it once, and it's far more effective. I suppose, but the agreements we've had in place previously with CFA with burning is CFA light the fires because they're volunteers. They go home, they teach the younger kids how to burn, and then after that, the fire's handed over to ourselves when they think it's safe. It was just, I suppose, in this unfortunate situation, because they were so held against this burn plan and the fuel moisture being so low, for whatever reason, it left a really sour taste in the appetite of people to continue doing it because of the cost involved.
Yeah, no, look, I understand what you're saying. It just doesn't happen like that out here. If we light a fire, the roadside burn, it's our responsibility till it's out. And in all honesty, in 1984, and David would remember it, because of all the humus that blew out of the paddocks for poor grazing management practices in those days that landed on the roadsides, I think we were out there for 14 days. I mean, we just put countless quantities of water on that dry humus to try and put it out, which is probably, sadly, John, where a lot of the phalaris came from in the first place. But, you know, we've got to deal with that looking forward.
Yep, we have got some other questions, and I do want to give people a chance to get those answered. So I might move on. Thanks for the answers on those, everyone. Question for Ben or John is, do we know if native plants are flowering and seeding earlier with a warming climate? And would this affect a 1st of January date as well with burning and everything shifting?
I do actually have some plots looking at this. At the moment, we're not seeing that, but it is something that's predicted to happen with climate change. Now, I suspect if we're seeing earlier curing in the grasslands, we'd be getting earlier seeding and flowering sort of coupled with that. Yeah, but at this stage, we're not seeing that, but it is something that we'd expect to see in the future.
Yeah, I just point out that that'll vary from year to year. It's probably 3 years ago when it was super dry. I mean, flowering happened very early in the season, and I imagine in a year like this, where it's been a lot wetter, you know, we'll see later flowering. You know, but it's going to vary. I think what we would expect is that to happen, but we need to be a bit more proactive and be able to do things rather than probably be thinking that far in advance. But I like where you're coming from. I'd like to just quickly say I was the one that came up with, a long time ago, burn after the 1st of Jan. But the reason that was actually very interesting, it was in the western districts in the Dunkeld kind of brigade area. So that doesn't necessarily apply to Geelong, that doesn't necessarily apply to Keilor, it doesn't necessarily apply to Port Fairy. So I think there should be flexibility. I'm really pragmatic about this. The one thing, and Ben's pointed out, we're losing these sites because we're not burning them, we're not managing them. Like, we know that actually is the worst outcome of all. And hearing Mark, if we're going to still rely on volunteers, and it is fire protection, so at the end of the day, if fire protection needs can be met, can our conservation or our preservation of grassland needs still be met? I think the answer will probably be a resounding yes, because the alternative is we know it's just not working at all. So I think we actually have to change our mind and reshape our thinking to say, can earlier burning, if that's what is required by volunteers, and the landscape's changed. When I started working in this landscape, and Mark and Dave have been there a lot longer than I have, cropping wasn't a thing. You know, we didn't have crops. You know, this is all sheep grazing country. Now the asset on private land are crops that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so I understand why people want to protect their assets as well. And so the situation of why we were burning 50 years ago for fire protection was happening in a different landscape that was all just sheep. And now we have far less sheep, and we've got lots of canola, and we've got wheat. And the critical time for those species is typically as the fire season, or as things start curing and things start drying out. And so grasslands become a liability then as a conduit for fire into those. So we do need to think about, can we meet these objectives? A long time ago, it was actually proposed that spring burning was a thing. It is a good thing to do for grasslands if you have particular perspectives about managing exotic annual grasses, for argument's sake. So oat grass and stuff, if you want oat grass invaded grasslands, burning them early is actually designed to knock them out because they're seeding, they haven't set seed. It actually was seen as a really desirable thing. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to actually learn, working with others. There's clearly a coalition of the willing here. Everyone wants to see a good outcome here. I don't think anyone's actually butting heads saying, we don't want this. We're actually all the coalition of the willing. So what we should actually invest in is, if this is our future, let's figure out what it means for the plants and the animals, what it means for fuel protection, because I mean, you guys do the burning, not me, but I always think, crikey, how do you burn this stuff when it's 30% moisture or whatever? And maybe that gives you the sufficient kind of fires that you need. Maybe it's actually patchier and it's actually really good for grasslands because you're actually having little bits of unburnt stuff as well, whereas our summer fires clearly are much more thorough fires. So I think we need to reshape our thinking, and I think tonight's been really good to have Mark's perspective, to have Andy's perspective, in the organisation. Have Ben's amazing social research that just tells us again, no one's here saying we hate this stuff. It's more about how do we actually get it to happen. And I think that's where we need to head and resolve, probably fairly quickly, actually.
Yes. Good. Well said.
Well said, John.
Yeah. No, very, very good message. And there's no doubt, and I should have said that right from the very start. We've got the speakers and everyone on board here are dedicated people who just want to get the stuff burned. So that's where we should be heading, and we need to make that happen. As the title says, burning matters. So how do we expedite that? That's the main focus.
Dave, we've got a question here from Yvonne relating to, will earlier burning have the associated issue of soil conditions not necessarily being dry and risk creating wheel ruts by trucks driving over them, which, as we know, will result in future weed invasion? So is this something that would be taken into consideration in burn planning, like trucks not being on the road, or I suppose checking that the soil is dry enough? Mark, I see you've got your hand up.
Yep.
Considering what I said, that this area has been burning for 70 odd years, and we were burning as early as we can. I can remember burning November, December, then into January. It depended on the seasonal conditions at the time. Now, the earlier you burn, yes, the ground might be wetter, but it's not that wet then. I mean, you can't burn when it's soaking wet. So the trucks actually don't have to go onto the brakes so much because there's less need for control because it's not as hot. So there's probably a bit of a win-win there, that we can leave the trucks on the road till something absolutely happens. You've still got to water your power poles and round the trees. You've got to do that anyway. That's got to happen regardless of timing. But I don't see earlier burning as being a big issue with regard to that. And remember what I said, we've done it for 70 years when we wanted to till the last 10, 15. And that was usually early.
Thanks.
Yep, I concur, Mark, and yeah, I think it's a balancing act. So that's what Mark, as the burning controller, will need to juggle. Not too wet, not too dry, just that happy medium somewhere in the middle to get as much done as possible. What other questions have we got, Amy or Aggie?
There was one from Deb Reynolds a while ago asking, saying she noticed that some significant sections of the West roadsides were mowed in 2018. Do you know why that happened? I think this actually also happened early this year. A lot of areas were mown or slashed. Can someone maybe talk to that one?
Yeah, if we're talking around Chatsworth, we did that to support the Karamat, We did that to support the Caramel community because the brigade's not burning at the moment until we sort out the private appliance fit for purpose protocols. So to support that community, we slashed the highway there that would normally be burnt to reduce the fire, to lower the fuel load. And the Western Highway, Hamilton Highway, the brigade there between Penshurst and Caramel also requested their highway be burnt for this summer because they were not in a situation to burn it. So it's a temporary measure. It's about reducing the summer fire risk and supporting our brigades to support their communities, basically.
Thanks, Andy. Now there's a question here from Marion. Is it feasible to use fuel to assist burning green phalaris? Does anyone want to answer that one?
Using fuel to
the
lighter.
I'm not.
Question.
The lighter
Fuel says to
we
me
use.
petrol, diesel, something frightening that you wouldn't want on there, probably.
So that's probably a bit of a not really feasible.
Well, you use fuel as a lighting method, but that's a drip torch. It's not. I mean, green grass doesn't burn. I mean, green grass under stress will burn when it's dried out by nature. But phalaris being a later maturing plant, it dries off a lot later. And I don't know if maybe we ought to get the army out with a flamethrower and see how it works.
I think you had the answer earlier, Mark. Spray topping. I mean, it may actually be spraying a phalaris and then burning is actually probably more of a solution. And we've tried spray topping in the past over near Derrenellum, and it worked really well. But again, it's who's going to do it, who's got the time, all that kind of stuff. But it works. And so this idea of spray topping is spraying. Phalaris grows earlier in the season, so you can actually whack it with herbicide. It dies back or gets under stress, as Mark said, and then you have a fire, and it's probably going to at least consume the phalaris. So it's not a silly question, Marion, at all. It's there are actually probably ways to do it.
Yep. And I've just got a comment, perhaps, Aggie, while you're looking for more questions, another question. We're probably nearly out of time, aren't we? But
yes,
with my cultural burning experience up in the Gulf country, we actually did pre and post burn surveys of flora and fauna. So they go quite a bit of trouble of identifying sort of vegetation and animals and things with animal traps, nets and things. And it's under the authority, I guess, or the guidance of the Queensland Fire Service, and they have a one-page fire plan, and that's all they have to work on. One page.
I love it.
The locals go out and Andy. Do it. I just thought I'd throw that one in.
Yeah, no, I'm hearing you, but it's probably a less complicated situation. Our challenge is to make it less complicated at the local level. If we could get all landholders to absolve us of insurance responsibilities, it'd be a lot easier. For example.
Now we do have 1 minute to go, so I'm not sure if we can really get into any more gutsy questions, but maybe, Dave, if we just remind people about recordings and emailing questions through to us that we can forward on to presenters.
Yes, which you're doing very well.
Okay. Yeah, look, there are so many questions, and they're all fantastic questions, and it would be nice that we could just keep going, but I think 2 hours is probably people's limit. But you would have all responded to Amy, so dobbing Amy in here big time. But if you've got questions, please do email them through, and we'll make sure they get to presenters. we will be able to email out the recordings, and we'll be able to sort of cut them into each presenter, the Q&A session, and the entire event. So yeah, please do keep in touch. But look, I'll hand back to you, Dave. I'm stealing your limelight.
Righty, I thank you. We'll certainly wrap it up, I think, because it is time. And I'd like to thank John and Ben and Mark and Andy for their input and participation today. It's been great. And I think one of the aims was to sort of get the conversation going and create the discussions and try and find a pathway to make more burning happening. And we know that burning matters. We've just got to make it happen. But I would like to thank you all for your time today, and thank for all the participants for logging on and listening to us. And hopefully we can keep the conversation going and get the ball rolling effectively. Thank you, one and all.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone.
David.
Thank you, Dave, as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. It's been
Okay.
really great.
All right.
See ya.